Hey guys, it's Brent. As promised, I'm going to record a series of video lectures that cover the content in Chapter 10 of your textbook on photosynthesis. So you can expect a series of about 4 different videos that cover different aspects of photosynthesis. But yeah, I'll be gone October 28th through November 1st. We're not going to have lab or anything this week, but I do expect you to keep up with these videos and take notes on these videos as if you were in class. Hopefully you will use your actual class time to watch these videos and not sleep through it all. But at any rate, keep in mind that when I do get back, so on November 4th, that Monday, I'll be starting some brand new material. We're going to be starting the next unit on genetics, but I will hold a review session for the photosynthesis mini exam, which will be held on November 8th, that Friday. I'll hold a review session, I think during lab, on November 5th, and also on Wednesday, November 6th. So do be aware of that. But also, if you are listening to this video before November 1st, what I would like for you to do is, if you're interested in earning some extra credit points, is I would like for you to create some type of a biology-themed Halloween costume. And I want you to take a selfie or have someone else take a photo of you in your costume and email that to me by 11:59 p.m. So you have some time on October 31st, and briefly describe what your costume is in the event that it's not obvious. I don't care what the costume is. Come up with something kind of creative. Don't go out and spend a bunch of money or anything like that. Just come up with something based on stuff that we've talked about over the course of the semester. Submit that photo to me by this deadline right here, and I'll add some extra credit points to your mini exam on photosynthesis. But if you are listening to this video before this deadline, please, please, please do not share this information with your classmates, because I want you to get the points for actually being proactive in watching the videos, and I don't want to award anyone points that has not spent any time watching these videos. So please keep this to yourself. Thank you. But at any rate, I'm gonna start off with just a very brief sort of overview of photosynthesis. The term itself, you're probably familiar with the general concept of what photosynthesis is. We're going to go into a bit of detail here, but photosynthesis is dealing with using light in order to make things, right? So photosynthesis means light, synthesis means to build things. And so we're going to be talking about how that happens biologically. But before I get there, I just want to quickly review and go back to this idea of this question that we've been trying to address over the last couple of weeks, and why do we eat, right? And we really spent a lot of time sort of emphasizing the energy aspect of things. So we do eat food in order to get energy out of it, particularly in the form of ATP, and we produce ATP in a variety of different parts of the aerobic respiration pathway. So energy is a really big component of it, but we also need to think about not just the energy component, but we also eat because of the raw materials that the different macromolecules that we consume in food provides for us. So things like fats and proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, so on and so forth. We have to have raw materials in order to build all of these different molecules that are found in our bodies. So we eat for energy, but also I'm gonna write this, is that we need a source of raw materials. Particularly, we need a raw source of that was a horrible circle, of carbon that can be used as the building blocks for all of these different molecules that perform a lot of really important functions in our bodies. But if we go back to cellular respiration, do recall that through this process of glycolysis, there's pyruvate oxidation, which is not illustrated on here, going through the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, electron transport. There's a lot of different things that are being sort of consumed and produced in the process. And again, if you just sort of recall what the general chemical reaction for cellular respiration is, so C6H12O6, if we're starting with glucose, we react that with 6 molecules of oxygen, and that will yield us 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water, and ultimately it's going to release energy in the form of ATP, as we've already checked off here. But it's also really important that you still understand, even though you've already taken an exam on this material, is understanding where all of these different materials or all these reactants and where these products sort of come into play. So obviously the molecule that gets input into cellular respiration, at least the way that we've been talking about it, is glucose, right? So we start off with glucose that gets consumed in the process. You should also realize or understand that where oxygen comes into play is in oxidative phosphorylation, particularly being at the end of the electron transport chain is the last electron acceptor, and when oxygen receives those electrons, it gets reduced and produces water. So one of the byproducts of this reaction is water being released. Now, alternatively, when we're breaking down carbon, or glucose, the idea is that we're starting off with a highly reduced molecule, so a molecule that has high potential energy, and we're producing carbon dioxide as a waste product, which is a highly oxidized version of carbon that has very low potential energy. And you should realize and recall that carbon dioxide is kicked off during the pyruvate oxidation phase. So there's a little bit of carbon dioxide that's taken off as pyruvate enters the mitochondrion and goes through pyruvate processing, but also from the Krebs cycle, we're going to be producing some CO2 as well. So interestingly enough, so glucose and oxygen are being consumed in the process. Carbon dioxide and water are being produced in the process as a release of energy in the form of ATP. But a really big question, I think, ultimately comes from is like, okay, we're consuming this food in order to build these, so we have some raw materials for building macromolecules and also energy, but where do these molecules come from in the first place? And ultimately, the answer to that is all of this can be derived from photosynthesis. Again, photosynthesis is using light in order to synthesize complex, high-energy molecules, particularly carbohydrates. That's one of the things that we think about, and it's this very specific form of carbohydrate that's going to be produced in the process of photosynthesis called G3P, which is a molecule you're already familiar with, and that will sort of serve as the raw material for building a lot of other types of molecules. But photosynthesis in general, again, it's taking energy from the sun in the form of light, and it's going to also take in carbon dioxide to form it provides a raw source of carbon, and ultimately as a byproduct of that, we're going to be able to produce some carbohydrates that result from the carbon that's coming in from carbon dioxide. So we're using the energy from light in order to ultimately reduce these carbons and carbon dioxide in order to produce carbohydrates that have high potential energy. But also, that's part of this reaction is that plants require water, and water isn't just like water for providing, dissolving solutes and that sort of thing. But water plays a really, really critical role in photosynthesis because it supplies electrons for photosynthesis that we'll talk about in a little bit. And so ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to end up oxidizing water. When we oxidize water, so we're taking electrons away from water, a byproduct of that is oxygen. Of course, photosynthetic organisms, so things like plants, algae, cyanobacteria, without them producing oxygen, we would not have the oxygen to consume in order to break down these organic molecules in the first place. But if we look at the general chemical reaction for photosynthesis, it takes carbon dioxide and water plus energy, and it yields organic molecules. So this is a simple compound here, a simple type of carbohydrate, and the release of oxygen. And what you should notice here is that this reaction is going to be highly endergonic, so it's going to require an energy input. You can tell that because the left side of the equation has energy in it, but if you also look at the reactants and the products, you should be able to tell me that it's endergonic, because the carbon dioxide here, again, it's a highly oxidized form of carbon, very, very low potential energy, and the form of carbon that we're going to get as a product of this is going to have high potential energy. And the reason that this molecule has high potential energy is because we're going to have a bunch of these types of bonds here, so these unstable carbon-hydrogen bonds. So if you're going from low energy to high energy, you have to have an energy input. In this case, it's in the form of sunlight, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. Now, if we look at the broader equation, what you'll see is that the broader equation actually takes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, reacts it with 6 molecules of water, plus energy from the sun, and we end up producing C6H12O6, so glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. You've actually seen this equation before. If you look at this equation carefully, what you'll notice is that if we reversed that chemical reaction, went in the opposite direction, we would have cellular respiration, right? So going from left to right in this case, we have photosynthesis, but going from right to left, we have cellular respiration. So these two major types of chemical reactions are two of the most important reactions on the planet. We go this way from right to left in order to take these high energy molecules and break them down to produce energy. But if we go in the other direction, if we're taking carbon dioxide that we're actually breathing out, so plants are taking in that carbon dioxide and they're taking in water, not just water that we're that's being produced through cellular respiration, but water from other sources as well. And in the presence of energy in the form of sunlight, we can produce high energy organic molecules and release oxygen as a byproduct. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis are essentially reverse processes that require each other. And ultimately what this means is that if photosynthesis did not happen, life as we sort of know it, terrestrial life, would not be available. We would not be able to survive in the absence of photosynthesis. So the importance of plants can't be stressed enough because they take in carbon dioxide, this highly oxidized form of carbon, and ultimately they're going to be producing a high energy molecule in the form of a carbohydrate, but they're also releasing oxygen as a byproduct, and that oxygen is something that we need. So oxygen to a plant in this case can be considered a bit of a waste product, although that's a little bit of a misnomer. But what I should also point out is that plants undergo this process because they need to produce their own food. Plants cannot actively move around and go secure food. They can't go and eat things. So they have to use photosynthesis in order to make their own food. So they make their own food in the form of a carbohydrate. And once they've made those carbohydrates, they can break those carbohydrates or other macromolecules down using cellular respiration. So it's a bit of a misconception sometimes that students think that plants are only photosynthesizing, but they're photosynthesizing in order to provide food for themselves as well. So they still need a source of energy to perform all their functions. So they still have to produce ATP, and the only way that they're going to be able to produce ATP that they can be used for performing a lot of different functions is to take those high energy molecules in the form of a carbohydrate, run those through cellular respiration as well. So plants also undergo cellular respiration in order to extract ATP from the food that they have created themselves. So they have mitochondria inside their cells, as do most other eukaryotes. Now, in terms of where photosynthesis takes place, I'm largely going to focus on plants. So there are several different types of photosynthetic organisms. Plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and some other bizarre things, but I'm largely going to be focusing on plants. And inside plants, the photosynthetic organelle is referred to as a chloroplast. Chloroplasts have some similarities to mitochondria in that there's a double membrane that surrounds it. Chloroplast has an outer membrane, and there's also an inner membrane, and in between those membranes is going to be an intermembrane space. But contained within the inner membrane is a large sort of fluid-filled sac that's going to be referred to as the stroma. Now, make note of this particular structure right here because it's going to be an important site for where like the Calvin cycle that we're going to talk about in the third video takes place. But the stroma, don't confuse that with the term stoma. Stoma is going to be another structure that we're going to talk about in the fourth video, which refers to these pores that are found on leaves that allow gas exchange to happen. But these are two different things, so do take note to make sure that you're familiar with your terminology. So stroma and stoma, difference being only a single letter. Those are very, very different things when it comes to thinking about photosynthesis. But at any rate, inside of the stroma, so this large sort of fluid-filled cavity inside of the chloroplast, you can find a series of these disc-like structures that are piled up into these stacks. Now, these individual discs are referred to as thylakoids. And if we were to look at these thylakoids in a little more detail, so if we can come over here, this image right here shows a stack of thylakoids, and we refer to as a stack of thylakoids as a granum. That is the singular, so a single stack is referred to as granum. Multiple stacks, the plural version of that, you'll sometimes come across the term grana. So this is the plural version of granum. But a thylakoid itself, again, it's just this disc-shaped structure that is hollow. It is surrounded by membrane. So if we sort of blow this up, so if we come over here, the thylakoid membrane that surrounds this cavity inside of it is just made up of a phospholipid bilayer, as are all membranes. And embedded within that thylakoid membrane are photosynthetic pigments. The most important one that we'll talk about is chlorophyll, that are embedded within that has, and chlorophyll has this general structure right here that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, but there's this structure called the porphyrin head that has this big structure here, and this long hydrocarbon tail, and the structure allows the chlorophyll molecule to embed itself within the thylakoid membrane. But this molecule right here is going to play a really critical role in a set of reactions known as light reactions. So light will actually interact with chlorophyll, cause some changes that will lead to a lot of important things that go on in photosynthesis. But if we go back to the thylakoid, these hollow discs right here, so there is this space that you can see, this sort of hollow space, and that space right there is going to be referred to as the lumen. Now, that term lumen is not specific or unique to thylakoids. This is just any sort of hollow space. So, for example, our intestines have a lumen, our blood vessels have a lumen. It's the opening, the sort of the space that's contained within the structure. Now, if we look at this image over here, this is an actual microscope slide of a plant leaf showing you all these different plant cells, all these structures that I'm sort of tracing right here. This is the cell wall, which is going to contain a lot of cellulose, so a structural polysaccharide. So there's the cell wall, and contained within it is the actual cell, and all of these individual green ovals and circles, those are your chloroplasts. So individual plant cells will often contain a large number of chloroplasts, and all of which have this general structure right here. So familiarize yourself with the general structure of a chloroplast, because this is going to be important as we start working through in more detail some of the various phases and whatnot. various sets of reactions. Now, to sort of finish off this general introduction of photosynthesis, I want to point out that photosynthesis is largely consisting of two major sets of reactions. And so what I'm going to do, the structure in general right here is the chloroplast. So photosynthesis again takes place inside the chloroplast, but I'm going to sort of draw a line that divides this in half to indicate the difference between the two sets of reactions. On the left side of the line, we have what we're going to refer to as the light reactions, which is also indicated right here. So the light reactions are also frequently referred to as the light-dependent reactions, and they're referred to as the light-dependent reactions because they depend on the presence of light. These reactions cannot happen unless light is present. So what we'll see is that light, which is going to come from the sun, is going to interact with these thylakoids, which we had just talked about. So the thylakoids are those disc-shaped structures that are found inside the chloroplast. Again, within the thylakoid membrane, you've got chlorophyll molecules, which are capable of absorbing light, and I'll talk about that more in the next video. But over the course of that reaction, what ends up happening is that, if you look at the overall chemical reaction for photosynthesis, recall that the inputs are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The outputs are carbohydrates and oxygen. So we want to be able to account for where all of these things are taking place. Well, the light itself provides the energy to drive this endergonic reaction, but one of the molecules that is consumed is water. So water is really, really important for the light reactions. Ultimately, what we'll talk about is that the light reactions end up oxidizing water, and as a byproduct of that, we produce oxygen. So we can account for in the light reactions where water is consumed and where oxygen is produced. You'll also note from this image right here that the light reactions produce two different forms of energy. It's going to produce some energy in the form of ATP, and it's also going to produce some energy in the form of this molecule called NADPH. Now, what you'll notice is that this molecule looks very similar to NADH, which you'll recall is a high energy electron carrier that was found in cellular respiration. NADPH does the same exact thing. The only difference between NADPH and NADH is the P. There's an extra phosphate group on this particular molecule. That's not super important, but what you'll gather from when we start talking about the light reactions is that NADPH, we start off with a molecule called NAD+. It gets reduced, takes some high energy electrons, in the form, and it becomes NADPH, and then ultimately ATP and NADPH are going to be funneled over to the next set of reactions. The next set of reactions, just very generically, are referred to as the light independent reactions. They're referred to as the light independent reactions because they do not require the presence of light in order to occur. So you might sometimes hear them also referred to as the dark reactions. Now, dark reactions, I'm putting dark in quotes because dark does not necessarily mean that it has to happen when there's no light. They're called dark reactions more as a colloquialism that refers to the fact that we don't need light in order for those reactions to occur, but they can occur when it is light outside. But again, the major players in the light independent reactions are going to be carbon dioxide. So if we look at the formula down here, so carbon dioxide is consumed in the reaction. So carbon dioxide plays a role in the light independent reactions, and you'll also notice that the output of the light independent reactions is going to be the actual carbohydrates. So we can account for all of these different molecules in the overall reaction of photosynthesis. And you'll also note that in the Calvin cycle, it will also release a molecule or molecules of ADP and phosphates, which get recycled and go back to the light reactions, because again ATP is going to be produced from ADP and phosphate. So there's this general sort of recycling of these molecules, and the same thing is that once NADPH is consumed in the Calvin cycle and gets oxidized, NADP plus is going to move back to the light reactions. So we're going to have these cycles of recycling of these different energy molecules. Now you'll notice that I haven't mentioned this term Calvin cycle yet, but we also, when we're dealing with this other set of reactions, they might be referred to as light independent reactions, dark reactions, or sometimes you'll see them referred to as the Calvin cycle, or even old school, you might see things called the Calvin-Benson cycle. But the big picture is that all of these reactions, these 4 different names, refer to the same set of reactions. But again, photosynthesis is largely broken down into 2 major sets of reactions, the light reactions and the dark reactions. And what we'll do is I'll record separate videos for both of those sets of reactions and go into detail in terms of what's going on there.